Okay, gives me great pleasure to welcome Suraj Malladi to the OR seminar. So, Suraj is actually has recently joined Cornell. He joined during the pandemic, and I think many of us were not aware. So we knew about his work, but we didn't actually realize he was here till we suddenly realized he was. But before coming here, he was at the GSB in the economics department at the business school at Cornell, at Stanford, where, from what I can make out from his profile, he had 4 different advisors, which is a first for me. So he worked with Mohammad Akbarpur, with Matt Jackson, Mike Ostrowski, and I'm missing someone. There's a 4th. Oh, even you forgot. Next. So he had at least 3. But then he also did a bunch of work with Amin Saberi and a bunch of other people. So he's been working on a lot of problems which...
Andy Skripach, my actual advisor, my main advisor. That's who we were missing.
This is being recorded, so okay. And Andrew Skripach. But so Suraj has been working on a bunch of topics at the intersection of sort of networks, information, and economics. But I think there's a sort of secret agenda, at least which I see in most of his papers, which is he sort of sets up problems which look like they should be very, very complicated optimization problems, and then kind of pulls the rug out and convinces you that optimization is completely unnecessary and there are just much easier ways of doing things. So in some sense, I felt this is a good place for him to talk to all the optimizers here and convince us why optimization is not very useful for these problems. And so over to you.
Great. Thanks, Sid. And thanks everyone for joining me here today. I hope this is the first of many meetings that we'll have here at Cornell. I'll have to disappoint you in this talk. I actually do optimization, so there are no magic tricks here. So the title of this talk is Delegated Costly Screening. And before I get into my paper, I thought it'd be a good idea just to take some time to give a bit of background on the topic and introduce some terminology. So to that end, let me start by saying something that we all know, which is that prices are often the main tool of directing the allocation of resources from people who value certain goods and services less to those who are willing to pay more for these things. Okay? But of course, there are some markets where it's inappropriate to use monetary transfers for a variety of reasons. Right? And sometimes in some of these markets, ordeals will take the place of prices. Now, what are ordeals? Ordeals are just various sorts of inconveniences or costs that agents endure in service of signaling that they have high value for the resources that are being allocated. So let me give just a few standard examples. So you can think in the context of patent applications. The cost of filing for a patent is the time that you spend and various other monetary resources and effort. This cost might dissuade certain people, particularly those with low value innovations, from applying for a patent in the first place because they think, okay, it's not really going to be worthwhile for me. So in this situation, the cost of application is the ordeal. The thing that's being allocated is approval for a patent. Another example is the disbursement of welfare. So particularly in developing countries, it's very hard to distinguish for governments who are those people who are relatively worse off and who's relatively better off. Where should these welfare benefits go? So a common approach to solve this problem is to design what are called workfare programs, where agents are asked to undergo various sorts of menial, low productivity labor, and in return they'll be given welfare benefits through the program. The idea is that this isn't really attractive work, and people who are really, don't have many good outside options are going to be the ones who are attracted to doing this kind of thing, and so you end up targeting benefits to the people who really need them, right? So here the ordeal is this unpleasant labor, and the thing being allocated are welfare benefits. And you can think of, you can see a lot of examples of ordeals in other settings, particularly in cases where the thing that's being allocated is heavily subsidized, so monetary payments are completely ruled out as a tool for determining allocated priorities. Now, just like in the case of pricing, once we have some tool that induces strategic sorting, we can start to think about how do we optimally deploy various ordeals, right? So in the case of pricing, the question of a welfare optimizing menu of prices and quantities boils down to designing something that induces that those people with really high values to end up getting the goods that are being allocated. When you think about ordeals, there's an additional wrinkle when you think about welfare maximization. So what is this wrinkle? Well, we still want goods to go to those people who value them the most. But at the same time, it's wasteful to have people exert costly effort in order to obtain these goods. And so we want to design menus that have good allocative efficiency, just like in the case of pricing, but at the same time, don't induce agents to expend a lot of wasteful effort purely for the sake of signaling their value for these goods. So there's this additional concern. And the classic papers that sort of work out how to design these optimal screening menus through ordeals are Nichols and Zeckhauser in 1982, and then Besley and Coate in 1992. And they apply their theories to particular applications like like screening in the context of public health care and then workfare programs. Okay? And more recently, Lemley and Shapiro propose revamping the patent process and thinking of this process as issuing patents in terms of designing a mechanism where basically applicants can self-select into different difficulties of passing these rigorous exams, and people who select to participate in a more rigorous application process will be awarded with longer patents if they're successful in actually getting their application through. Now, in addition to this sort of theoretical work, there's been a lot of recent empirical work that basically looks at the value of ordeals in a variety of different settings. So people have looked at measurements in the context of welfare, people have looked at workfare programs, and so on. However, as you might expect, the amount of research that we have looking at the efficacy of ordeals is far outshadowed by the amount of research that we have on pricing. Zeckhauser says as much in a 2021 paper. It says ordeals are scarcely studied, little understood, and often accepted without thought. Conscious attention to their design and operation could greatly enhance that value. And so this paper is basically going to try and think about the design of ordeals, but sort of bring to the table a new consideration, namely the fact that principals will often delegate the task of screening to various intermediaries. Okay, so in the context of pricing, you can think about franchisees and cashiers who are asked to implement menus that are set by company headquarters or store owners. Analogously, in the case of ordeals, you can think of bureaucrats or government officials who run the workfare programs or innovation approval processes that were designed by policymakers, maybe sitting in some central government. Now, in the context of pricing, it's often easy to ensure that the intermediary enforces the principal's desired menu, right? So if you think about a cashier, it's going to be very hard for him to offer people lower than advertised prices, because at the end of the day, the receipts that he gets has to match the remaining inventory in the store. But in the case of ordeals, in a lot of contexts, it's harder to tell whether intermediaries are actually doing as they're told. So for example, you can think of a patent officer who has specialized expertise in understanding these applications. He may be better situated to understand how much effort actually went into a particular application, and a policymaker might not understand this. Alternatively, in the welfare context, you might have a bureaucrat who's actually on the ground observing how much effort various agents are actually putting into the program, and then the person who designed this program is sitting at the capital of the country, doesn't actually know what's going on or how much work is actually being done. And this creates an issue for the policymakers, because essentially in these contexts, intermediaries might be able to, in effect, impose their own will over the design of these screening mechanisms and ignore outright what the policymaker actually asked them to do. And this isn't just a theoretical concern. So for example, in the context of workfare, the NREGA program in India, there's a lot of evidence that there's widespread non-compliance with the schedule of rates and wages that the central government actually sets. So that brings us to the main question of this talk, which is when and how can policymakers control the behavior of such intermediaries who've been put in charge of these screening tasks? And the goal in this talk is going to be to first propose a model of delegated costly screening, try to convince you that that's a reasonable model, This then sets up basically a two-stage mechanism design problem, where the policymaker is trying to design a good mechanism to ensure that the intermediary designs a good mechanism to screen agents downstream. This is a very rich problem, and in order to tackle it, I'll take a prior free approach and then talk about why I think that's reasonable and what it might tell us about the case where all the actors in the game are Bayesian. And then finally, I'll discuss some of the implications of the results for how to conduct regulatory governance. Okay, so that's the broad exercise of this paper. I'll pause at this point to see if there's any questions. Great. Okay, so let me start with a preview of the model that I'll do in pictures before I get to the formalization. So I'll basically stick with this workfare example for the rest of the talk just to fix ideas. So I'll call the principal a policymaker, the intermediary is a bureaucrat or a local government official, and the agent is an applicant to the workfare program. Now, typically the motivation behind workfare programs, as I mentioned, is to ensure that resources are well targeted to the people who really need them the most. And as such, there's going to be basically two main goals that both the policymaker and bureaucrats are going to have in this context. The first is that both of them will want to keep down allocation errors. You don't want to give too many benefits to those who are relatively well off, or too little to those who are really in need. Right? So you want to keep down allocation errors. At the same time, as I mentioned, you don't want these applicants engaging in too much onerous labor. Their time is perhaps better spent elsewhere, trying to find jobs or something like that. And so you want to keep down applicant screening costs as well. And you're trying to balance these two goals. The main friction between the policymaker and the bureaucrat in the baseline model is going to be that one cares more about keeping down allocation errors, and the other cares more about keeping down applicant screening costs. So you can think about someone who ideologically thinks we should just be giving out welfare, we should be moving towards a welfare program where we're cutting everybody a flat check. On the other hand, you might have someone who worries a lot about people who aren't deserving of these benefits getting them and wants to move to a situation where you really do a lot of screening and is less concerned with these applicant screening costs. Okay, so there's two main frictions in the model that essentially drive the results. The first is the usual friction that we see in screening problems, which is that the applicant has some private type theta that's unobserved by both the policymaker and the bureaucrat. And this type determines how difficult it is for the applicant to engage in work, how valuable it is to receive the benefits through the program. Now, there's an additional second friction in this model. And this friction is that the intermediary observes the costly effort that the applicant engaged in, whereas the policymaker does not. And it's this second friction that allows the intermediary to essentially go rogue and offer his own screening mechanism, which I have pictured here. The x-axis is the amount of work that the applicant engages in. The y-axis is the level of payment that the intermediary is going to give the applicant for the corresponding amount of work. Okay? So this blue line here is the ideal menu that the intermediary or screener would like to offer. What does an applicant do? Comes into this program, takes stock of his own private type, looks at the menu that the bureaucrat is offering, and then decides how much work to engage in to receive the corresponding level of payments. Now, in general, the policymaker is going to have an ideal mechanism which looks different than the bureaucrat's ideal mechanism. The policymaker's ideal is pictured here in this dashed gray line. Now, even if the policymaker insists that the bureaucrat follow her favorite mechanism, the bureaucrat could ignore these orders. So, for example, if the policymaker says, you tell me how much work the applicant engaged in, and I'll be the one to pay the applicant, bureaucrat can say, okay, turns around to the applicant and says, you know, this blue mechanism is still the real mechanism. You decide how much work you want to do. Applicant takes stock of that, chooses the same amount of work as before. The bureaucrat then reports to the policymaker that the applicant engaged in a lot more work than he actually did, and then secures for the applicant the same level of payments that he would have had he been the one in control of these payment decisions. Yeah?
Are you going to assume that, like, at least there's I don't know, like a fixed budget or something that is aligned between the bureaucrat can only change payments but still needs to satisfy some budget, or
Yeah, so I think so. I might be saying exactly what you're talking about. This slide over here. So this is not what you have in mind. Let me know. So the next point that I wanted to make was that just because the policymaker can't actually choose the screening mechanism directly doesn't mean she's completely toothless. So in particular, she can set restrictions on the space of allowable allocations for the applicant. So she can say, for example, any applicant who's eligible for benefits through this program on the basis of readily observable characteristics should be paid at least certain floor, but should not be paid any amount exceeding certain cap. Right? And that's the situation pictured here. The policymaker can do something even more complicated than that. She can say, for example, that there is some low, middle, or high tier of benefits that are allowable, and then she leaves it up to the bureaucrat to determine which level of efforts merit which levels of rewards. So what does the bureaucrat do? The bureaucrat looks at this restriction. He knows that he can no longer credibly offer his ideal mechanism to the applicant because, for example, it includes certain ranges of payments which are not allowable and the policymaker would never give the applicant. And so he instead moves to a new menu given this restriction, and this new menu satisfies the codomain restriction imposed by the policymaker. So does this answer your question?
I guess maybe I was also additionally thinking if there's many customers, or not customers, what do you call them? Applicants. I imagine. Somehow is it normalized that like, if I as a intermediary offer everyone more, but then the population size is the same, then at some point I like run out of budget faster than if I were playing by the policymakers.
Yep. Yeah, that's a very good question. So here I will focus on the case where the intermediary is essentially dealing with a single applicant. You can think about this as the case where there's multiple applicants, but there's aggregate uncertainty over how many people will actually join the program. So for example, you might be worried about setting a restriction saying only 5 innovations can get approved through the innovation approval process this year, and then you all of a sudden end up with like 30 really, really big innovations. And so if you have a lot of aggregate uncertainty, you might not want to place those sorts of budget restrictions. But you can definitely think about situations where there's less aggregate uncertainty, and so you want to use budgets as an additional tool over which you sort of constrain this intermediary and think about richer mechanisms. But for this talk, we'll focus on the case where there's essentially one intermediary and one applicant. Okay, so let me just say everything that you saw on the previous slides a bit more formally. So a policymaker P chooses a non-empty closed set X of allowable allocations. A bureaucrat B chooses a right continuous menu Y, mapping the amount of effort the applicant's engaged in to an allowable allocation. And finally, an applicant A submits costly evidence or work given its private type in the bureaucrat's menu. Okay. Now the applicant has the private type theta in some abstract type space, and theta determines the applicant's marginal benefit of receiving allocations through the workfare program and his marginal cost of exerting effort. Right, so I'll denote those by tau of theta and c of theta. In this talk, for simplicity, I'll assume that this type space is finite and that the costs of exerting effort are uniform across all agents, so they're really distinguished by their benefits of receiving payments. These assumptions aren't necessary for the results, but they'll make it a lot easier for me to draw pictures. Okay. Now, the objective of the applicant is to choose an evidence level, n sub y of theta, to maximize the following objective. He chooses an evidence level or effort level to maximize the difference between his benefits of receiving payments, which is tau of theta times y of n. Right? Y is the amount of allocation he would receive if he exerts effort level n, minus the cost of exerting that effort, which is just n after a normalization. Okay, so next I want to tell you something about the objectives of the policymaker and the bureaucrat. But before I do that, I want to make a comment about the model, which is that the richness of the intermediary's action space makes it challenging to study optimal mechanism design in this instance. Right? So what you have is the policymaker chooses arbitrary subsets of allocation space, and a bureaucrat responds by choosing menus that satisfy the codomain restriction imposed by the policymaker. And so to make progress on this problem, I'll take a prior-free approach. Namely, I'll assume that both the policymaker and the bureaucrat have min-max objectives, where they're trying to minimize their worst-case loss, taking worst case over the realization of the agent's type. And there are a couple interpretations that you can think about. One is in a context like innovation approval, you might think that there's really stark uncertainties, and the policymaker and bureaucrat ex ante don't really know what are the types of innovations that will come through the process. And they want to design mechanisms and processes that are sort of robust to these uncertainties. In the context of something like publicly funded healthcare or workfare programs, it may not be that we have no prior over the sort of types of agents that are entering into the program, but we might still be worried about protecting against worst cases for different reasons. So for example, if I'm designing a publicly funded healthcare program, and the ordeal that I'm using to screen people is putting them in waiting lines, then I might worry about political opponents who cherry pick really bad instances in my program to essentially portray it in a bad light. So they might find those instances where people waited in lines for a very long time and still only received relatively poor quality service, or those instances where people who shouldn't have been on the program were still getting a lot of benefits and gains. And so I want to design something that's sort of robust to these sorts of outcomes. Okay, so with that comment, now let me tell you about the bureaucrat's objective. The bureaucrat chooses a menu Y to minimize the following. Minimizes the worst case loss, worst case again taken with this max taken with respect to the realization of the agent's type. And this loss consists of two components. The first component are these functions f sub theta. These are type-specific losses due to allocation errors. Right? So for every different type of agent theta, my menu gives a certain amount of allocation to that type, and that induces a certain loss for me. What I'll assume about these f sub thetas are that they are continuous and strictly quasi-convex in allocations. And the reason is to capture the idea that there is a right level of allocation to give an agent of a certain type, and deviations from this right level of allocation will lead to larger losses for me. Yeah?
Deviations in both directions.
Deviations in both directions, but they need not be symmetric, so this f sub theta is allowed to be fully flexible. Now, in addition to losses due to allocation errors, there's also losses due to applicant screening costs. This is the part where I'm worried about agents exerting wasteful effort. And so again, I have type-specific loss functions. Why? If someone is relatively well off and they exert effort, I might not care as much as someone's really, really poor and could be using that time to do other more valuable things. So I want to allow for heterogeneity in types when it comes to these losses. What I'll assume about these type-specific losses due to allocation or due to screening costs is that, again, that they're continuous and strictly increasing in the amount of work the applicant engages in. So the more wasteful effort that the applicant puts into the program, the worse off that I am. And I'll assume, of course, that if nobody puts in any effort, then there's no loss. Alpha is the weight that this bureaucrat places on allocation errors. 1 minus alpha is the weight that the bureaucrat places on applicant screening costs. Okay, now finally, the policymaker, as I mentioned before, chooses an allowable allocation set X to minimize an objective function that looks really similar to the bureaucrat's. The main difference between the bureaucrat's objective and the policymaker's objective are that the bureaucrat places weight alpha sub p on allocation errors, whereas the policymaker places weight alpha sub p on allocation errors, whereas the bureaucrat places weight alpha on allocation errors. So if alpha is greater than alpha sub p, we say that the bureaucrat is biased towards reducing allocation errors. And if alpha is less than alpha sub p, we say that the bureaucrat is biased towards reducing screening costs relative to the policymaker. Okay. The other difference that you'll notice is that there's an additional min operator floating around here. What this says is that if the bureaucrat is indifferent between multiple optimal menus, a bureaucrat will break those indifferences in favor of the policymaker. Are there any questions about the model?
Yes, just to clarify, so you're saying, so both the policymaker and the bureaucrat measure the losses the same way, but they just weight on the losses is different.
That's right. So the friction in the main specification is that they face the sort of same types of losses, but place different weights on them. And I'll tell you later what can be said about the case where we have fully general differences in terms of how we think about losses, what even constitutes an allocation error in the first place, and so on. So you might think of instances where, one worries more about type 2 errors and the other worries more about type 1 errors. You might have instances where one has favoritism towards agents of certain types and the other doesn't, and so they disagree on what an error is in the first place, and so on. So I'll talk about that in the discussion.
See, and then the other thing is the bureaucrat observes the amount of effort, but policymaker doesn't actually observe.
That's right. That's right. And that's sort of in the backdrop here. So I showed you here a game that's being played by the policymaker and the bureaucrat and the agent, right? We could have taken a mechanism design perspective instead. There is a sort of equivalence principle, which is an analog of the taxation principle, that makes it so that restriction to this particular class of delegated screening games that I'm focusing on here is without loss of generality for the policymaker. But that's floating in the background, and I just directly told you the game that the policymaker's playing. So if we find the optimal delegation set here, it's actually optimal over all the sort of mechanisms that the policymaker can design. In a world where the intermediary observes effort, but the policymaker does not.
By delegation set, you mean what are the
The allowable allocation space.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's the only thing there. So the policymaker only controls what you are allowed to give in terms of device, and the bureaucrat controls the full function.
Exactly. And that's essentially the restriction coming out of this lack of observation. Okay, so with that, let me now state the main results. So for that, I'm going to have to introduce a few pieces of terminology, so bear with me for 3 slides. I'll go back and recap what all the words mean again. But here's a first attempt. So I'll say that X is a simple delegation set, so this is the set of allowable allocations, if it's an interval. And I'll say that governance is complex if X equal to the 0-1 interval, which means full delegation. I place no restrictions on the bureaucrat. Full delegation isn't optimal, but there's no simple delegation set that improves over full delegation. Right? So just leaving it up to the bureaucrat isn't the best thing I can do, but if I do want to create an improvement, I would have to do more complex things than just set a cap and a floor for what the bureaucrat can pay the agent. Next, I'll say that X is a perfect delegation set if the set of bureaucrat optimal menus coincides with the set of policymaker optimal menus. So once I impose this restriction, I can actually induce the bureaucrat to choose my favorite menu. If I can do that, then the delegation set I've identified is perfect. And I'll say that governance is futile if full delegation is indeed optimal, but full delegation isn't perfect. So the best thing I can do is to fully leave the decision to the bureaucrat, but the bureaucrat ends up doing something that's not my favorite menu. Okay, so I think this is the last slide of terminology. So for a given alpha sub p, right, the weight that the policymaker places on keeping down allocation curves, I'll say that a delegation set is robustly optimal if it's optimal for all alpha greater than alpha sub p. or all alpha less than alpha sub p. But the idea is that I only need to know the direction of the bureaucrat's bias. And once I know the direction of the bureaucrat's bias, the same delegation set ends up being optimal for all such bureaucrats. And similarly, I say that a delegation set is robustly improving if it improves over full delegation strictly for some alpha greater than alpha sub p, and weakly for all alpha greater than alpha sub p. Right? So it's a restriction that I can place on the bureaucrat once I know the direction in which the bureaucrat is biased, that weakly improves my outcomes in some states and strictly in others.
Sorry, the comment you made said, I shouldn't think about greater or less, you're saying,
Yeah,
I
this
just
is
need to know the
yeah, exactly. So here I wrote everything in terms of greater, but we could flip these inequalities. The idea is that I know the direction in which the bureaucrat is biased, and once I know the direction, that's all I need to know to find my optimal set, or if that's all that I need to know to find an improving set, then I call those sets either robustly optimal or robustly improving. Okay, so here's the first theorem. Suppose the bureaucrat is biased towards reducing allocation errors. So this is the case where alpha is greater than alpha sub p. Then there exists a delegation set X star, which is simple, perfect, and robustly optimal for the policymaker. Namely, you can do the following. Suppose you're the policymaker. Imagine how you would design the menu if you were actually the bureaucrat on the ground and observing the amount of effort the applicant engaged in. So take your ideal menu, and now find in your optimal menu how much you're allocating an agent who exerts no effort. This is an agent who's eligible for benefits through the program on the basis of observable characteristics, but decides under this menu that the best thing is to exert no effort at all. Now, however much you're allocating that agent, set that as a floor on the bureaucrat. And now let the bureaucrat decide what menu he wants to choose given this restriction. Right? So all we had to do in that process was just introspect and decide how we would have done things. So it doesn't actually require knowing anything about the extent of the bureaucrat's bias. So whenever the bureaucrat is biased towards reducing allocation errors, we can set this restriction and induce the bureaucrat to choose our favorite menu.
just to, like, so the free option, so I should think of this as something like a basic income, something like that, right?
Yeah, like a minimum payment through the program. Or in the context of innovation approval, you could think about it as like a sandbox environment where you say, even without submitting much evidence, you're allowed to market this to a limited group of people. The second theorem considers the other case, the case where the bureaucrat is biased towards keeping down applicant screening costs. If the bureaucrat is biased towards keeping down applicant screening costs, meaning alpha is less than alpha sub p, and full delegation is imperfect, then it turns out that governance is either complex or futile, and no delegation set is robustly improvable. Right? So in contrast to the previous case, it's the only kind of improvements that potentially exist are ones which are complex, so there won't be caps and floors. They'll be setting different levels of tiers of benefits. And it turns out that you need really detailed information about the bureaucrat in order to make these things work. So for example, even if you found a complex restriction that improved outcomes from your perspective as a policymaker for a particular kind of bureaucrat who's biased in this direction, then there exists another kind of bureaucrat also biased in the same direction for whom this restriction would strictly backfire over placing no restriction at all. And so you need detailed information about the bureaucrat's bias in order to even affect a positive change in this world. Right? So in that sense, regulatory governance is easy in the world where the bureaucrat is biased towards keeping down allocation errors. Easy in form of optimal delegation sets and easy in terms of the amount of information that I need to know about the bureaucrat in order to do this. On the other hand, delegation is hard in the world where the bureaucrats bias towards keeping down applicant screening costs. Hard both in form of delegation and in demanding in terms of how much I need to know about the bureaucrat's bias in order to actually affect positive change. Are there any questions about this?
Yes, I'm still trying to parse, like, do you have an example of like these two cases?
Sorry?
For, like an example in, say, the workfare setting of, so I should, like, what does it mean if you're biased towards allocation error versus screening?
If you're biased towards keeping down allocation errors, then you're someone who wants to develop a very stringent workfare process. If you're biased towards keeping down applicant screening costs, then you're someone who would like to see the program move towards a welfare program, where we just do means testing and then we give everyone who passed the same level of benefits, and moving away from a welfare program.
So some of bureaucrats should believe screening is important to improve the overall welfare. To improve.
Bureaucrats should, yeah, exactly.
I see.
And in the other case, things are a lot harder.
So the example I guess I was thinking of is something like, if I think about like grading for students or something, we believe students, there's a certain amount of work they need to do, whether we feel it's useful or not. You need the people who are grading to believe that they have to do this for an overall welfare of society or something like that, to give the right grades.
Something like that. Yeah, that they have to care more about allocative efficiency. Okay. So maybe settings that aren't, some stories that people like to tell maybe about innovation approval processes are that if you think about something like approval through the FDA, a commonly told story is that regulators worry a lot about errors, but people in Congress might worry more about screening costs because they're worried that if you go through this really rigorous process, which is really expensive, then that ends up leading to higher drug prices for the end consumer. And that's a reason why they worry more about applicants' screening costs in this situation. The applicant is the pharmaceutical company than the regulator might. Or another sort of commonly told story is that the FAA is perhaps pays too much attention to the production schedule of a company like Boeing and worried about their costs of testing and making sure that everything's on track. Meanwhile, Congress might say, look, I don't care how expensive it is for them or if things get delayed. I want to make sure that we're only approving planes which have the highest safety standards. And so there is a situation where the policymaker cares a lot more about keeping down allocation errors and the bureaucrat cares more about keeping down screening costs.
I see. So
You can think of those sort
and these settings are simple. So,
sorry?
so these are the settings which are simple. So
The setting, no, the setting, in my story, the FDA setting where they're worried more about keeping down allocation errors is the simple case. In the FAA setting, trying to control the FAA and making sure that they do what Congress wants would be the harder setting. So there's a lot of things that are floating around in regulatory governance there that aren't captured here, but you can use that as sort of a way of thinking about these two worlds where regulatory governance is easy or hard. Okay, so how much time do I have?
say it's 20 minutes or 15 to 20 minutes.
Okay, so let me give you a sketch of what the proofs look like here. So the key lemma that drives the results is the following. So let me just define what is a free option. Free option is the amount of welfare or benefits that are given to an applicant who shows no evidence. And let Y be an unconstrained bureaucrat optimal menu with a free option Y not. Lemma 1 says that the bureaucrat attains his worst case payoff on the free option. So once I design my optimal menu, I actually experience my worst case loss for some agent who takes the free option. Part 2 of this lemma says the free option is the same in all bureaucrat optimal menus. So I might have multiple optimal menus, all share the same size free option. And finally, the free option in bureaucrat optimal menus is weakly decreasing in alpha. So the more weight that I put on allocation errors, the smaller my free option gets. Okay, so let me sketch for you the proof in the case where there's just two types, and the proof in the general case is analogous. So suppose there's two types of agents, low and high, L and H, and 0 is less than L is less than H, and that's their marginal benefit of receiving allocations. If I had complete information, the optimal amount that I would award the low type agent is denoted by YL star, and the amount that I would ideally allocate the high type agent is YH star. But of course, I don't observe their types. I have to screen for it, and so I have to design a menu. The revelation principle tells me that it's equivalent to think of the bureaucrat's problem as picking an amount to allocate the low type and an amount to allocate the high type, and the corresponding evidence levels that the low type and high type have to show to receive the allocations that were meant for them. And by Meyerson's lemma, an allocation rule Y is going to be implementable if and only if I allocate the high type agent weakly more than I allocate the low type agent. Right? Because the high type agent has a higher marginal benefit of receiving payments. So let's just take an objective function and see and characterize the optimal menu. So in this objective function, the losses are quadratic in allocation errors. That's the difference between the amount I actually allocate an agent of a certain type and the ideal amount that I would allocate that agent. And they're linear in applicant screening costs. So the screening costs that I face is just 1 minus alpha times the amount of effort that the agent exerted. So let's just solve this step by step. The first observation is the amount I allocate, so the amount of evidence I require from the low type agent is just 0. These screening costs are wasteful, so what I should tell these agents is, if you don't want to exert any effort, you can automatically get the low allocation level. But if you exert a little bit more effort, you can get the high allocation level. Because I'm trying to make things as easy as possible for them. In the same spirit, the amount of evidence that I would require to obtain the high allocation level is the level that would make the low type agent exactly indifferent between choosing the low allocation that was meant for him or choosing the higher allocation. That's the cheapest price that I could charge for the high type allocation and still separate agents so that the low type chooses this low allocation level and the high type chooses the high allocation. The next observation is that I will always over allocate to the low type agent in an optimal menu. Why is this? Well, suppose for a moment that the amount that I allocate the low type agent in an optimal menu is YL star, right? So in that world, I would make no allocation errors on the low type agent, right? Because I'm giving the low type exactly what I would give the low type if I knew ex ante that he was a low type. But moreover, by observation 1, I also don't face any screening losses due to screening costs on the low type agent because the low type agent gets that for free. So I never face any losses on the low type agent in a world where I have a menu that gives the low type agent YL star. But of course, I'm worried about the worst case type realization, so I'm always paranoid about this case where I face the high type agent, because if I face a low type agent, I never face any losses. So all my losses are coming from the high type agent, with whom I will face losses either because of allocation errors or because of some screening costs. Now, how do I reduce the amount of loss that I face on the worst case, which is here is the high type agent? Well, I can jack up the amount that I allocate to the low type agent for free. Because by observation 2, that makes it so that I can require less evidence for the high type agent to receive the allocation that was meant for him. So by making the free option sweeter, the high type agent has to exert less effort in order to obtain the level of allocation that was meant for him. Right? And I'm going to keep doing this trick of increasing the size of the free option up to the point where the losses that I face on the low type agent, now due to allocation errors, and the losses that I face on the high type agent, which are due to a sum of allocation errors and applicant screening costs, are exactly equalized. right? That's going to make my worst case menu give me as little loss as possible. And the final observation is that the amount that I allocate the low type agent is decreasing in alpha. The more that I care about these allocation errors, the less likely I am to rely on this trick of increasing the size of the free option just to reduce the cost of the allocation for the high type agent. I start to become more concerned with making sure that I give the low type agent the level of allocation that was meant for him, and the high type agent the level of allocation that was meant for him. If you think about the case where I don't care about applicant screening costs at all, I would give the smallest possible allocation to the low type agent, which is YL star, and I would give YH star to the high type agent, which is the largest possible. Okay, so the proof in the general case is it goes exactly like this, but we don't need to make any assumptions about single crossing or the shape of the type space in order to do this. So lemma 1 basically gives us a very key property of bureaucrat optimal menus. And the proof idea for the theorem is essentially to keep applying lemma 1. So theorem 1 is the case where the bureaucrat cares more about keeping down allocation errors than the policymaker. So alpha is greater than alpha set P. Right? Now, in an optimal menu, we know by lemma 1 that worst case loss occurs at the free option. And we know by the third part of lemma 1 that the policymaker's optimal menu has a larger free option than the bureaucrat's. Why? The policymaker makes the free option larger to make the applicant screening costs go down elsewhere in the menu, whereas the bureaucrat who cares more about keeping down allocation errors chooses a smaller free option. Right? So these are the two facts that we know from lemma 1. And the situation is pictured over here. On the left, you have the policymaker's optimal menu. The x-axis, again, is work. The y-axis is the level of payment. On the right is the bureaucrat's optimal menu. And you can see that the bureaucrat has a smaller free option, which is the intersection with the y-axis, than the policymaker does. Policymaker has a larger free option to reduce applicant allocation or applicant screening costs. So let's consider for a moment what happens when the policymaker imposes the following restriction in the allowable allocation space. Right? The policymaker sets the floor exactly as we talked about in theorem 1. Says, I know where I would choose the size of the free option in my optimal menu, and that's now a restriction on the bureaucrat. The bureaucrat can't pay the applicant any less than that. And suppose for a moment that the bureaucrat reacts to the policymaker's restriction by choosing the policymaker's favorite menu. The question now we want to ask is whether the bureaucrat can do better than this. Now, from the policymaker's perspective, there's many points along her menu where she might be experiencing worst case loss. What lemma 1 tells us is that she's definitely experiencing a worst case loss for some type of agent who takes the free option, but there might be other types on which she faces worst case loss as well. In fact, in our 2-type example, she faced the same loss on both the low type and the high type agent. Right? However, notice that for the bureaucrat, the worst case loss only happens for a type that takes the free option. And to see this, imagine scaling down the bureaucrat's objective by a constant so that the weight the bureaucrat places on keeping down allocation errors is the same as the weight that the policymaker places on keeping down allocation errors. Once you scale things down this way, it's easy to see that at the free option, where there are no applicant screening costs, and both of them have the same weight on allocation errors, they're going to have identical losses. Elsewhere, where there are screening costs, the policymaker places a greater weight on those screening costs than the bureaucrat does. And so the bureaucrat has strictly lower loss than the policymaker elsewhere along the menu. And so the only point where the bureaucrat will face his worst case loss is at the free option. So what does this tell us? Consider the following deviation by the bureaucrat. The bureaucrat chooses a different menu with the same sized free option as before. Well, this menu has the same loss as this red curve, right, at the free option. And the loss elsewhere might only be weakly greater. And so the worst case loss from this deviation is only weakly higher than the worst case loss from sticking to the red curve. Alternatively, if the bureaucrat moves to a different menu like this menu has a larger free option and therefore a strictly larger worst case loss from the bureaucrat's perspective. So there are no profitable deviations for the bureaucrat. The best thing the bureaucrat can do in response to the restriction set by the policymaker is to choose precisely the same menu as the policymaker did. And this is a simple restriction which was perfect. It induced the bureaucrat to do exactly what the policymaker wants. And the policymaker didn't need to know anything about the extent of the divergence in preferences between herself and the bureaucrat in order to set this floor. Now let's consider the other case. This is the hard case, where alpha is less than alpha sub p. Here, the policymaker is more concerned with keeping down allocation errors. The bureaucrat is more concerned with keeping down applicant screening costs. We have the opposite situation, where the bureaucrat's optimal menu has a larger free option than the policymaker's optimal menu. So the first observation is that floors can't help. If the policymaker sets a floor like this, all that does is makes the bureaucrat choose a menu with a larger free option, which is worse from the policymaker's perspective. So floors are no good. Similarly, if the policymaker sets a cap that's binding, then this cap pushes the bureaucrat off of his ideal mechanism. And so the bureaucrat chooses a menu with a larger free option, because remember, in optimal menus, the worst case loss has to occur at the free option. And so because the bureaucrat now faces larger loss, he will choose a menu with a larger free option, which again is bad from the policymaker's perspective. So caps that look like this don't help. There's a pesky case we have to consider, which is, what if I set the cap to be so binding that the bureaucrat has no choice but to choose a menu that has a smaller free option than I, as the policymaker, would choose. Right? So here we have to go through a couple steps of reasoning to see why this is actually not good from the policymaker's perspective. First, consider a bureaucrat who doesn't care about allocation errors at all. This is a bureaucrat who says, we should just do everything in terms of a welfare program. No screening. Let's cut everybody the same check. That bureaucrat is going to choose a completely flat menu. In fact, in the space of completely flat menus, that bureaucrat would choose the optimal flat menu. Right? Now, the policymaker prefers a bureaucrat who is less extreme to a bureaucrat who only cares about applicant screening costs. Right? So the policymaker prefers this blue curve to this green curve. But the policymaker also prefers this green curve to this red curve, because the green curve is the optimal flat menu. The red curve is just some flat menu that we induce the bureaucrat to choose after our cap. Which then tells us by transitivity that the policymaker prefers the menu that the bureaucrat is already choosing over the menu that the bureaucrat would choose if there was a really binding cap that looked like this. Now, a complex restriction that allows the policymaker to choose that allows the bureaucrat to choose the same size free option as before can't help things for the same reasons that we saw caps couldn't help, which leaves as the only option restrictions that don't let the bureaucrat pick the same size free option as before. So if we take a restriction like this, the bureaucrat has to make a jump, has to make a choice. Do I jump to a menu where there's a larger free option, or do I jump to a menu where there's a smaller free option? If you carefully calculated these intervals, these allowable payment intervals, you might be able to make it so that the bureaucrat prefers a small jump downwards to a larger jump upward. So a restriction like this induced the bureaucrat to now choose a menu with a smaller free option. This might not immediately mean that it's better from the policymaker's perspective, but this is the only thing that has hope of producing something that's better from the policymaker's perspective. However, we can always find a different type of agent, and this is what the proof shows. And I won't go through this argument. But we can always find a different type of bureaucrat who has a menu like this, for whom this small jump upward will be better than making a jump downward to a menu with a smaller free option. And so once you impose this restriction, this bureaucrat sort of shifts his menu up slightly, which of course is worse from the policymaker's perspective. So the same restriction that helped with one bureaucrat strictly backfired when faced with a different kind of bureaucrat. And we can always construct that other type of bureaucrat. So that's sort of the sketch of the idea. So I think I have about 5 minutes left, right? So let me just mention to you some of those other results that Sid raised earlier in the talk. First, we were considering the case where the alpha, which is the preference parameter of the bureaucrat, was known to the policymaker, but we might be interested in what happens when we really don't know anything even about the direction of the bureaucrat's bias. And this corollary tells us that, in fact, a min-max optimal undominated mechanism for the policymaker is to set a floor just exactly as in theorem 2. Right? Even if you don't know anything about the bureaucrat's bias, this is the best thing that you could do. If the floor is binding, congratulations, you induce the bureaucrat to do exactly what you want. If the floor is not binding, then it's completely harmless and doesn't change the bureaucrat's behavior. And you can't get a mechanism that does better than this in every state of the world. So that's where we get the undominated part. Okay, so the next point that I want to talk about is that we have a pretty austere toolkit here for playing around with the bureaucrats' choices. So we're restricting the space of things that the bureaucrats allowed to offer as payments, and that's essentially the only mechanism. In practice, you can think about other sorts of things that policymakers might do to incentivize bureaucrats to behave in one way or another. Okay? One way that I sort of think about the results is to say you can do things like costly monitoring. You can do things such as giving promotions to bureaucrats who perform better than others, and sort of designing incentive contracts in a way so that the bureaucrat behaves the way that you want. And so a way of interpreting the results is essentially telling you when is a bureaucracy costly to maintain, and when can you basically get the bureaucrat to do what you want even without introducing these costly measures, rather than to literally interpret the policymaker as being unable to do those things. One such thing that a policymaker might be able to do is to affect bureaucratic incentives through a variety of coarse tools. So for example, if I'm writing the mandate of the FDA, I might say to them, look, you should pay attention to both the costs that pharmaceutical companies face and the sort of drugs that are being passed through this process. Or I might tell them, don't worry about the costs of the regulated industries. Your job is only to make sure that you do the best job possible. This is something that I could write down in a mandate of a regulatory agency. I don't know how effective these mandates are in moving around the preferences of the bureaucrats, but I might have the sense of in which direction it would push them, whether it would increase their alpha or decrease their alpha. And so a question that I can ask is there any actionable advice to give policymakers who can push around bureaucratic incentives in this coarse way? And the results suggest yes. So suppose the policymaker can increase alpha up to alpha H or decrease it down to alpha L. So alpha L is smaller than alpha H, but alpha L and alpha H and alpha are all unknown. I don't know what any of these things are. The recommendation that comes out of the results is to always increase alpha up to alpha H, and then set the floor as I discussed in theorem 1, or corollary 1. Why? This is going to dominate full delegation. If alpha H ends up being greater than or equal to alpha sub P, then we're in the world of theorem 1, this floor is going to induce the policymaker to do the optimal thing. If alpha H is smaller than alpha sub P, so even after pushing the bureaucrat's preferences upwards, the bureaucrat's weight on allocation error still fell short of our own weight as policymakers, then this still improves full delegation outcome. Why? Because the floor is no longer binding. All we did is push the bureaucrat's preferences closer to ours, so whatever the bureaucrat does under full delegation is better now from our perspective. And so the lesson for regulatory governance is that you always want to incentivize correctness by bureaucrats. Don't have them actually pay attention to the costs of agents, even if you care about them. Always incentivize correctness, but limit their scope for achieving it. Okay? Now, the last thing I wanted to mention is that you might have general disagreements over what constitutes allocation errors. So the disagreement in the main specification model was alpha versus alpha sub p. Do we care more about allocation errors or do we care more about screening costs? But suppose the policymaker's loss functions are fully general. So the policymaker has his own set of FPs and his own set of HPs. Proposition 1 says let YP be an optimal allocation rule for the policymaker. Setting a floor at YP naught is a weak improvement over full delegation for the policymaker. So this is a world where I can't tell you what optimal delegation looks like, but the same prescription from the results, which was to set a floor in a particular way by introspecting and seeing where we would set the floor at the free option, is going to be a weak improvement over full delegation, even in a world with fully general disagreement. So this idea of setting floors in this simple way is something that survives this sort of general disagreement.
Assuming they're increasing, or like you're assuming nothing on the loss function, or just that the losses are increasing?
Well, we are assuming the same things as before, that Fs are quasi-convex and Hs are increasing.
Same,
exactly.
Same form, but
exactly. And this is just a result saying that we can sort of, the idea of setting floors happens to survive in the case where we have expected loss, and now we have priors over agent types. But we need to make an additional assumption that these H sub thetas are linear. So again, doing Bayesian mechanism design, or two-stage Bayesian mechanism design is a very complex problem. What we can say is the things that I called optimal in the prior free approach turn out to be good, meaning sort of dominate setting no restriction at all in the world where we're Bayesians. Okay. So I'll just throw up this slide of related literature and pause here since I think I'm out of time.
We have questions. Okay, so I guess one. So it's still, when you show the pictures, it seems somehow like the payments and the sort of work that you do, they somehow seem symmetric.
Payments and work.
Or like the, I forget the word you use, the kind of useless work versus the amount, the allocation that you actually give.
Mm-hmm.
At least in the, so the results are not symmetric for sure.
Mm-hmm.
But where is the asymmetry coming about?
So are you making a comparison to the world where we have pricing instead of wasteful work, or?
I guess so. So there it is symmetric.
So in the world where you have pricing instead of wasteful work, it turns out that you don't have basically the lemma 1 that I get here to do this design. So this idea that the worst case happens for the lowest type agent. In fact, in that world, it's hard to pin down where exactly the worst case happens. And so it's really the fact that the device that you're using for screening is wasteful is a very big part in driving the results. So that makes this problem of delegating ordeals different than saying, like, appointing someone to be an auctioneer on my behalf or something like that. Because everything is coming out of that lemma 1 here.
Yes, so it's not, so even if it was prices, but people valued it differently,
Mm-hmm.
would you still get a similar phenomenon? It's like if someone was, I don't know, richer, and so if you paid, if they had to pay, it's worth less to them.
Yeah. My intuition is that you wouldn't get these same things without further sort of functional form assumptions on how those payments look.
It's
how much
important that it is just completely useless.
Well, I think it's it could be that it's slightly productive, but it would be better because given the opportunity cost to be doing something else. So you can, it's not like it has to be entirely wasteful work, but yeah, what they're doing is productive, but their time is much better spent doing something else. So their outside option is better. So is more productive. That's kind of what you need for the result to go through. And so usually the things that people are doing in workfare programs aren't like entirely wasteful, but the idea is that they could be spending their time doing something else. We're only really making them do that because we want to screen in the right types of agents, not because we think this is the most productive use of their time.
Questions?
Okay, if not, let's thank Suraj again.
Okay.